Hello and welcome to another Unreal Masterclass video. In today's video we'll be looking at how to set up cinematic cameras and then how to export our movie sequence. To start off, I have this scene here, which is a Tokyo scene which is cobbled together from assets from fab.com by a variety of creators. And I've gone in and added my own little touches here and there to give it a bit more life. I'm going to go to my Add Actors panel. So up here, this little cube with a plus, I'm going to go to the Place Actors panel because it's just easy to do it this way. Or you could do it via the cinematic option here. But I'm looking for, in the first instance, the camera rig rail. I'm just going to drag that into my scene like so and position it here. Now, by default, our camera rig rail will not actually have a camera attached. And what this actually does is allows us to create this little slider that will go along our rail. If I select my camera rig rail instance, you can see I have this white line. This white line represents our spline. If I was to drag the end of this spline along my axis like so, you notice that my rails get longer. And now when I go back to my current position value on the rails control under the details panel for the camera rig and adjust the current position on rail value, it now slides along the entire length of my rail. This current position on rail will be what we keyframe later when we get to the sequence element. If I click on my endpoint on my spline again, if I wanted to add a curve, with the endpoint selected, it now allows me to see this little cube in the middle. If I was to click on that little cube in the middle and was to move this, let's say, along our y-axis here, this will add a curve to our track. So you can see how we can start to build up curving lines and surfaces by adding key points along our spline. We're not going to go into too much detail about splines in this video. That is something that we'll be approaching in a future video. But I just wanted to let you know that that is essentially what is happening here. So with our camera rig rail selected, I'm going to need to add in a camera. To do that, under here on our details panel, we have this little plus and add button. So camera rig rail. But to make my life easier, I'm going to select the rail camera mount within this parented details object. So rail camera mount, with that being blue, I'm going to press add. And I'm going to scroll down until I can see my cine camera. The difference between a cine camera and a normal camera or a gameplay camera is that a cine camera allows us to adjust things like lenses and focal lengths and tries to emulate real-world cameras in more detail. Whereas the default game cameras don't tend to have settings for like ARRI Alexas or RED cameras, for example. So I'm just going to select the cine camera. This will add a cine camera underneath our rail camera mount. So this is parented, which means wherever our rail mount goes, our cine camera will follow. But it's not in the right position. And also, you notice it's also opened up this little window here. This is a preview of our camera. If I want to be able to see this at all times, I can click on the little pin button and this will pin it to my window. And with my cine camera selected, I'm just going to use my transform tools. So this is my select and translate. I'm going to pull it up. I'm going to move it along. And I'm going to use my rotate tool. And I'm going to reorientate my camera to be facing my subject. So let's line this up. There we go. So now we have my camera attached to my mount. If I go back to the camera rig rail and now move to current position, this will move the camera with the mount. And this is how we can emulate real-world camera dolly tracks. Doesn't have to be exactly on this surface, for example. I could lift this one up in the air like so. And now if I was to adjust my rail, it will go up an angle. But rails are designed very much for kind of linear motion. If I was to adjust and toggle the lock orientation to rail button, so let me just turn that on, you'll notice that the camera is still staying at the same angle. But if I was to click on here, and let's try and give a bit of a curve. So I'm going to put a curve into my track, and I now go back to my current position, and I was to now pull it, the camera will rotate with the track. If I turn that lock off and then try it, you'll notice that the camera now will rotate depending on the motion of my track, like so. So it's always going to be facing in the same direction. If I lock it, it's going to lock it to always face 90 degrees to our subject in this case. So just bear in mind that you might need to have this on or off depending on what look or feel it is you're going for. Let me just undo all that. And go back a few steps. There we go. So what we can do with any device here is we can keyframe these in what is known as a sequencer. Now we'll get to sequencer once we've added in the other type of cinematic camera rig that we can use. By the way, we could also just add in cinematic cameras into our scene like so. And these could be also keyframed and treated as such. We could animate the movement of these. The reason we're looking at rigs in this video though is just to give a little bit more smooth movement. But you could use the static cameras in the same vein as to what we're going to be doing with the crane and the rig. The other option we have for a rig is the crane. I'm going to drag that into my scene. And what the crane does, if I just position it like so, is essentially give our camera an anchor point, a pivot point to work from. So with our, let me just untoggle that so we can see what we're doing. Our camera rig crane is made up of a variety of controls or essentially elements. And under our crane controls, we can adjust things like the pitch, so the up and down, the yaw, the horizontal, and the length of our arm, the in and out in a sense. And again, we're going to be keyframing all these elements to be able to give our camera some motion and fluidity. But again, you notice camera with crane, no camera with it. So again, we have to go down to where it says camera mount, in this case, crane camera mount, select that, go to the plus add, type in Cine camera to add in our cinematic camera. And we're just going to adjust that again to where we want that to sort of sit for the initial position. Don't have to do exactly what I'm doing, but I'm doing it like this just to make it a bit easier for myself. And we're going to go back to our camera with crane. And now, as we move our camera around, the camera will stay fixed looking in the orientation that we've by default put it in as. Unless we was to toggle on our lock, so let's just turn our lock or pitch on. So now when I go up and down, the camera will follow the up and down motion. If I turn it off, it will always be staying facing forwards. If I do it with the yaw, the camera will also now rotate and orientate with the yaw of the camera, so the rotation. If I turn that off, it'll always be facing the same angle, no matter how I turn the arm. So again, toggle these on and off as you need to see fit, and we can also animate those also in our sequencer. So I'm just going to set everything to default for now. With any cinematic camera, So whether that is one on a rig or a static cine camera, like this one here, for example, if we have it selected and we look at the details panel for it under the current camera settings, we can adjust things like the lens settings, so what type of lens is used, the filmic look, which gives us things like sensor width, sensor height, f-stops. So again, if you know your cameras and you've got a particular look in mind, you can emulate it here and match it up with real-world cameras, for example. Our crop, if you want to crop in that sensor. Our focal distances. We can keep scrolling down. We also have options for post-process. So this can add in things like adjust our reflection data, our filmic slope and clipping, our color grading, our lens, so we can add in lens flare if we wanted to. We can add in vignetting. So getting a preview, you can see we've got vignetting going on with that camera. By the way, whichever camera we have selected, it always brings up that camera preview in this little mini window here. And if you ever want to lock them, just click on the pin tool to lock them, so you can see them at all times, even when the object isn't selected. And you can always unpin it by clicking on the same button again. And any of the values here can also be keyframed within the sequencer. So before we let's get on with that, shall we? So I'm going to go back to my content browser. Go to content. Let me just toggle off my toggle there. I'm going to right click. And for the purposes of this tutorial, we're going to go to Cinematics Level Sequence. Now, we could do a camera animation sequence. It would work in a very similar way. But because we're going to be wanting this to trigger at a very particular time or very set values, for example, if we wanted to play the cinematic at the start of a level or when the player enters a specific area, for example, we're going to want to use a level sequence instead. So I'm going to select level sequence, and I'm going to call this camera tutorial just for this video. But again, you would want to call this something that makes sense to what it is you're doing. I'm going to double click on that level sequence that I've just created. I'm going to close my sequencer curves because I'm not going to be playing about those. But when you do start keyframing, you can go into sequencer curve window and start adjusting the ramp values. For now, I'm just going to minimize that because we don't need it. You can still bring it up by clicking on the little animation curve editor there. So if you ever close it and need it back, you can always do it that way. I'm going to select my camera rail. I'm going to go to add, and I could either go to actor to sequence and search for it from within my outliner. That might take a bit of time. Or because I've got it selected, it actually understands that I might want to add that camera rail. So I'm going to add that camera rail because I've got it selected, so it knows what it means. And by default, it brings it in, but it doesn't know what to do with it. So at the moment, it's in our timeline, but we've got no properties or values to change. So with the camera rig rail selected, I'm going to click on the plus button. I'm going to scroll down, and I'm going to be adding in the current position on rail. I'm going to click the plus one more time, and I'm also going to turn on the lock orientation to rail in case I wanted to play about with that lock value. What I could also do here is click on that plus one more time, and I could go to the cine camera. And with the cine camera selected, I could have access to all the values here. So lens settings, focal settings, crop settings, etc. All of them are within these windows here. I'm not going to worry about them for the purposes of this video, but just to let you know, anything that's within our details panel, or most of the stuff in our details panel, especially if it's got a little diamond next to it, which is a keyframe icon, tells us that this is a keyframeable element. If it does not have a diamond, then we cannot keyframe it in our sequencer. I'm going to now select my crane. I'm just going to do the same again. So add active sequencer, add camera rig crane. Again, I'm going to press the plus button. I'm going to add in the crane camera arm, so arm length, crane pitch, crane yaw. I could also add in lock and pitch as well, again. And I'm also going to add in our Cine camera, just so if we want to, we can go in there and add in controls for that, if we see fit. So we have all our controls in here now, so let's start keyframing. So we want to take a note of our sequence length. So our frame rate is 30 frames per second. We can always adjust that by clicking up here and changing the frame rate. Now we need to make a note of what frame rate is we're using and how long we want our sequence to play for. So if we're going for 30 frames a second by default, for example, that's for every 30 frames, that is 1 second. So down here where we have our number of frames, which is our working range number, so 165, so let's get our calculator up. So 165 divided by 30 equals 5.5 seconds. So this from 0 to here would be about 5.5 seconds. Well, up to 165. So I'm going to, let's say, do this up to 300, which would be about 10 seconds. I'm going to adjust my slider just so I can see my full range from 0 to 300. And the red line here indicates the end of our sequence. So when it would go from, if we scrub this white line along our timeline, once we get to that red point there, that would be the stop point. And if we had it looping, it then resume back to 0 again. So it'd only play within this range here. To increase that range, I need to pull this little red handle, which is our start point, and I'm going to move that to our end, so our frame 300. I'm going to select my current position on rail, and I'm going to, wherever I see this little diamond with a plus in it, that's where we can add a keyframe, and the keyframe is denoted by this little white little circle here. I'm going to move along my timeline, so let's say 150, so however many seconds that is. Again, I could do the maths. I could do 150 divided by 30, so that's 5 seconds. Could add in another keyframe. So I want it to between 0 seconds and 5 seconds to basically return to the same value, and then around 2.5 seconds in, so that would be 75. So once we get to frame 75, which is here, I'm going to, with my current position on frame and rail selected, I'm just going to change this value, and I'm going to go all the way to 1. So what will happen now is if I scrub along my timeline, it'll go from 0 seconds to about 2.5 seconds, and then at 5 seconds back to starting position. And I could do this with any element on my timeline. So let's go to the crane. That might be a little bit more interesting. So I'm just going to start by keyframing my initial position. So what I want to do is I want to get my camera set up in my starting position in my scene before I start keyframing. I'm then going to go to where I want the ending position to be. And I'm just going to move my arm to what its final position will be. Do I want to adjust to your? So what will happen here is the camera will move up, over, and around to look at this bicycle and sign over here. But what I also wanted to do maybe at this point is adjust the arm length. So it's a bit more pulled in maybe. So the arm is going to pull and rotate around. And again, depends on what your kind of story or narrative is you're trying to tell. I'm doing this really quickly. I'm not doing this with any real intention. And with our Cine camera, we could go in and we could start adjusting things like the focuser. So as we start pulling backwards, we could adjust our focus range to also adjust with that. So we could do a kind of tilt, shift, pull focus sort of effect. if we get the values lined up. I'm not going to go into all that, that's cinematography terms. So if you're used to Premiere or After Effects, this will be a lot more intuitive to you. But at the moment, none of this is a video. This is motion, this is animation. How do we actually get this to be exported or triggered? Well, the way we do that is within our sequencer, I'm going to go to the Add button, and I'm going to add a shot track. Actually, am I doing a shot track? No, actually, I'm going to do a camera cut track, sorry. So I'm going to do a camera cut track. And this again has nothing in by default, but because I've got these two rigs in here, which also have cameras attached to them, Unreal kind of knows what it is I'm trying to do here. So if I go to camera cuts and click on the plus, it goes to our existing bindings, and oh, there we go. There's our camera rig with our whale. There's also our crane. Any other cinematic camera we put into our sequencer would also show up here. I'm going to go with my whale, and I'm going to move this along to here and just pull this scene down. So to adjust the length of your video or your scene, you just adjust the handles either side, like so. And I'm going to do it one more time, but this time for the crane. I'm going to pull this in to be the rest of our video. And I'm going to right click on our camera cuts and turn on Can Blend. And what this will mean is if I now pull my one clip over the other clip, it will transition between the two cameras. So to see this happen, I'm just going to lock my two cameras in my window. So these two cameras should be locked. So as I scrub along my timeline, you should see the two cameras moving. We won't be able to see the transition yet. We'll only be able to see that once we get to our kind of render stage. But what will happen is the camera will move in terms of our, we'll have that's like an intermediate camera between this camera and this camera, and we'll get this kind of flying shot where the camera will change between this one to this one. That's how the auto blend works. It has its uses and disadvantages. So for example, the problem here is the camera could theoretically or could clip through a mesh, which would not give us a desired result we want. So at that point, we probably wouldn't use a blend. So we just have them cut to cut. And then when in something like Premiere Pro or another video editing software, we would go in and refine that. Another thing we can do is, at the moment, these are sort of just going straight in as hard cuts. If I hover my mouse over my camera rig or my first scene here, very hard to see, but it's a little yellow triangle on the top corner of that video. If I pull that along, this will add in a fade. So we can do this to do a fade in, and likewise, there's a yellow triangle on the opposite end. If we can get a camera on it, it's quite hard to do. But if I pull that, let's make that life easier. So to make things easier, just zoom in. It's really hard to do. There we go. There we are. And now we've got a fade out. So again, we won't be able to see anything happen quite yet. So let's just save this for now. So I'm going to press save just to save our changes. I'm going to go back to my content browser, and for the sake of seeing this in action, let's get this into our scene. So I'm going to go to my camera tutorial level sequence. I'm going to drag it into my scene and just lift it up. And let's just press autoplay. And if I just press play now, our cinematic cameras will play. You'll go between those two actions. You'll play once, and then take us back to our gameplay. So that's what happens if we just have it as an autoplay. But I don't want that to autoplay. Also, I kind of want it to be exportable. So that is fine if I want to do like an intro cinematic to like a game or something, or I want to point out a particular event in my game. Like let's say I go down into a certain room, triggers a little cinematic to play. For example, something flying in and crashing into the building. I could do it this way. But I just want to actually have this triggered. So the way I'm going to trigger this is I'm going to go to place actors. I'm going to go into type in trigger box. So under volumes, it will be trigger, or easier way, just search for box. I'm going to make this box quite big. Let's say this size, and just lift it up a bit. Maybe it's a bit too high on the axis. And what I want to have happen is I want it to be so whenever the player enters this volume, it's going to play this level sequence, but this level sequence is not going to play otherwise. So with my trigger box selected, I'm going to go up to here to where it says our list of world blueprints. Open level blueprint. I'm going to zoom in because this is a bit small, so let's make this full screen. So with my trigger box is still selected, I'm going to right click, add event for trigger box, collision, and add on actor begin overlap. And I'm also going to do the same but for an end overlap. Now, I've got these two. It now knows when we enter something or leave something, we want something to happen. And what I need to do is reference this cinematic, our level sequence. So I'm going to right click and create reference to camera tutorial. I'm going to drag from this camera tutorial element, press play, and I'm going to go to play sequence player. And link this to our trigger volume. So once we enter, it's going to play this level sequence. Let's just tidy this up a bit. And actually, let's pause to the middle because I can use the same reference twice. So with our camera tutorial, I'm going to go drag one more time, but this time I'm going to type in stop sequence player. And again, just tidy this up a bit. Then it's full screen. And I'm going to select the output from our end overlap to the input of our stop. So the white, these white things here indicate our end or our output. This is our input. Output to input is what we're trying to do. And the red indicates our action or our trigger. If I wanted the cinematic to play upon the event or the level loading, I could do the same by just going to event, begin play, and linking this to my play button. That's if I don't want to use the autoplay function on that element, for example. I'm going to press compile and save. And I'm just going to minimize that. Make sure that autoplay is off on that, which it is. Now I'm going to press play. And I'm going to move my character into this little area here. And it's now going to play that sequence. So again, this is only about 10 seconds of length, not very long. So if we want to make that longer, we would either reduce the frame rate, which would have a problem because it could actually start to make things look like it's stuttering, or we increase the duration of our level sequence. So again, if I go to my level sequence, to increase our duration, we just change this value here. So let's say 3000, that makes that 30 seconds. I'm going to pull this all the way, pull my red handle, to this little red line at the end here. So you see this little red line at the top. I'm going to pull that to the very end. So make sure this is at our very end, like here. So 3000 to 3000. And I'm just going to move my cinematic, move my clips. So here's my camera crane. I want this now to be starting at 1500 an ending at the end. So I'm just going to drag the blue end. This is going to increase the distance between my start and end keyframes that I set. I'm going to do the same on my first one here, drag this handle to that point. And I'm just going to also have to move my shots. So my camera rig shot, I need to move that to match there. This one to move here. If I want them to overlap still, do the same. So this is where you ideally want to kind of get it right first time, but you can go back and edit it. So let's press save, and we'll try that again. And now this should be a longer cinematic now. And the camera should also move slower because of that. Oh, hang on. We've got those two the wrong way around. So let's just make sure those are the right way around. There we go. So just make a note of what your camera names are at all times. Let's not worry about having them fade in or fade out too much. So if now I go in there, so you see now the camera's moving a lot slower because the distance between the keyframes is greater. If I wanted to move faster, I would just reduce the distance between the two keyframe values. And this is how it works for any keyframing. So any property you can do this way. You can change the color of lights or textures by adding it to your level sequence, selecting the color value and keyframing it between one color and the next color with these different indicator points. And that would transition the cat color between the 2 points. This at the moment is a linear transition. There are different types. So we've got linear, constant, cubic. These are to do with how the curves are set up. So if I, again, when I was talking about the curve editor earlier, when it first opens up, and I select my, let's say my crane here, you can see how steep the curves are between the change between the beginning value and the end value. If we adjust those to, let's say, a linear line, this would make it more straight. So instead of it kind of gradually ramping up and then ramping down, this would be, the values would very much incrementally go up and down at a consistent rate. I'm not going to go into huge detail about keyframing. That is, that's definitely something that to explore if you are a video editor or into animation. But just let you know that that is essentially what keyframes are in the context of what we're doing today in this tutorial. Okay, so we have our cinematic created, our sequence is made, and we're happy with the timings, we're happy with the result, but we now want to be able to export this as a video that we can now edit and use elsewhere. So how do we do that? Well, luckily, again, within our level sequence, our sequencer that we've got our cuts in, our camera cuts, our transitions, etc. in, we have this little button here, the little clapperboard, the render this movie to a video button. Well, I click on it, and this will bring up our render movie settings. We have a few options on the image output format. The only video option we have is AVI, because we're using Windows, so we can only export as an AVI sequence. Our audio output format is, but if we want to be able to include our audio in our scene, we want our master audio submix. We could also have added in our sequencer some audio levels. So if we had an audio track, we could have added an audio track into our sequencer. I don't have one, so I'm not going to add it in. So I'm just going to use my level sequence. So my entire music is playing in my level instead. I could adjust the custom frame rate, but if I do that, it will overwrite the frame rate I've got here, so 30 frames at the moment by default. If I wanted to go with a custom rate, though, I could go in and change that. Just bearing in mind, that will change the length of your video and the timings between your frames, obviously, as you're dealing with a different number of frames per second as you would when you was originally mixing it. Your resolution, so you can set it to 1080p or just below 4K here. Well, 4K. Compression. So by default, it always has compression on. You can turn compression off if you want to keep more of the quality. Audio. So because our audio is saved separately to our video, we would have to, and it saves our audio as a .wav. We'd have to give our audio a file name. And likewise with our video. So I'm just going to give our audio the name test. And it saves our audio into wherever we save our video. So whatever our output directory is here is where our video and audio is going to be saved. So I'm just going to again call this test video. If I go to advanced, I have options to override certain settings like game modes, etc. I'm not going to worry about any of that. And under cinematics, we're going to keep it to cinematic engine scalability and cinematic mode on. And we're just going to leave everything else as default. Once we're ready, we just press capture movie. It will then start rendering our movie. Also ask us to save if we haven't saved any changes we've done in between. Now, don't worry if up here this looks a bit weird, like it's cropped in incorrectly. This is just a preview. It doesn't actually show you the full scene or the full capture of the window. When you actually play back the video, it will be the entire sensor, the whole frame. So do not go off what this little preview window shows you. It really does, for some reason, cut out. It does seem to like crop into one corner of the entire video. And again, depending on how long your video is and what quality setting you've got, this may take longer on some machines than others. I'm not going to render this entire video just because it would take too long, and the principle will already shown you working within the workshop itself anyway. So I'm just going to press stop capture. And there you go. That is the basics of using cameras and cinematic cameras, namely within Unreal 5. And a little introduction to sequencers. Sequencers are amazing things. They don't have to just be used for cameras. They can be used for any element. So if I wanted to have elements animated manually, let's say this dog, I could click on the dog, click add actor to sequence, add my dog. I could click on transform to take its current value position. I could then scrub along, move my dog along, keyframe again, and this would now my dog would now be moving along that value that I've changed within the location and rotation settings here. And again, any of these settings I could go into and I could adjust, so I could have it doing a kind of crazy motion. And this can work with any actor or element in our scene. It could work with lights. So let's find a light or add a light even. So add light, is that the spotlight? Add it over our performer. Add actor sequence, add spotlight. So with lights, I can keyframe the intensity. I could keyframe the light color. So I could go to light color, press on the keyframe there, can move along some time. I could adjust the values here, or to make my life easier, with the light selected, I could go to light color, click here, choose a new color, press OK, and then press keyframe, so the little diamond button on all the values, and that would take in the value of changing the details and add it to my keyframe here. So here it would change from white to blue, like so. And if the values aren't given to me there, for example, like the visibility, I could click on the plus track and use the actor hidden in game. And I could go, it's visible here. And then I want it to not be visible. So it'll be on, go blue, off. So you can sort of see by playing with these values and linking them together, you can start to build sequences, start to build narratives, start to build worlds using the sequencer as a framework to work from. The most important thing is working out how long you want things to take, how long you want the action to be, and then keyframing everything and timing it correctly. So take into account what frame rate you're using, how long you want your sequence to be, and what the intended use case of it is. Is it going to be something that triggers at the beginning of a level? Is it going to be something that's going to be exported? Is it going to be something that just animates on a loop? If it's going to be animating on a loop, then you ideally want the end keyframe and the start keyframes to be the same, so you don't get this random jolt of change, because it would just reset between the two keyframes. So you want to, if you're doing a looping animation, you want the first and last keyframes to be in the same values, no matter what the property is, just to make it loop smoother. And that's it. That is the sequencer and cinematic cameras in a nutshell. If you have any questions, don't feel free to always leave them down below or email myself. We'll be doing more videos in this part of this Unreal Masterclass series going forwards. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.